Welcome, I'm Michael Bickert. Thanks for joining me today as we explore concepts with the objective of improving your management skills and growing your business. I hope you have a pen and a notepad handy because I want you to make a commitment that you'll take notes and jot down some sort of action item, something that inspires you to move forward in your business today. Implement something in your business each and every day. That's what your notepad is for. Jot down something. Today, I want to talk to you about increasing your wealth. Now, our company BMI talks about wealth in a different sort of way. We define wealth, W-E-L-L, superscript T-H, as the simultaneous professional and personal improvement and success. But I actually am talking about W-E-A-L-T-H today. I want to help you increase wealth. So what do we have to do to increase wealth? Well, let's look to the greatest philosopher and economist on the matter. Back in the 18th century, Adam Smith described the creation of wealth, an inquiry into the causes and nature of the wealth of nations. And in that book, which is renowned and studied the world over, he states that the greatest cause of wealth is the division of labor. So I want to talk to you a little bit about that, make it make sense to you, and have it intuitive, because I think people just make this way too complicated. You'll notice that he didn't say that the greatest cause of wealth is central banking or quantitative easing or MMT, modern monetary theory, or UBI, universal basic income, or any one of these things that are so common nowadays. And talk about, you might say, well, of course, back in 1765 or whenever he wrote the book, he wasn't, some of these concepts weren't discussed. But nothing has changed in terms of what actually creates wealth. You need to think of wealth much more simplified. And what wealth is. So let's start there. How are we going to define wealth? I'm going to talk about wealth in terms of the improvement of your standard of living, your ease of access to things which you really need, those necessities of the body or those luxuries, the things that are available in abundance and not scarcity with respect to what you need and want. So let's frame it in that context and think of wealth as that. The ease with which you have access to those things that you need and want, and that improves your standard of living. So as wealth increases, your ease of access to those things increase. As wealth increases, you have greater abundance, less scarcity surrounding those things, those luxuries or those must-have necessities. That's wealth. And how do we increase wealth? Well, according to Adam Smith, once again, he says the division of labor. It's like, well, how's that possible? Like, why is it so simple? Why is the division of labor creating wealth? Well, I think in a word, it has to do with the increase in productivity. One word, productivity. So we have to produce things. We have to produce those things that we need and want. Without producing things, how could you possibly have greater wealth? All right, are we keeping this simple enough? You know, I want to make this really, really basic because some of the people who are the proponents of modern monetary theory, they make things very, convoluted, and it's really difficult to keep up and understand where they're coming from. But you and I can really agree on a simple level that if somebody doesn't produce something, then how could we have that in abundance? It wouldn't exist. So we need production. And division of labor increases productivity. So productivity is activity which produces things. So think of it that way. Activity which produces things, and we understand that if we don't have things, we can't have an abundance of things, then our wealth, our standard of living doesn't improve. And that's where the link between division of labor and wealth comes in. So let's think of division of labor as specialization. So instead of one individual doing everything he needs to produce for himself, there are multiple people collaborate and cooperate in order to produce things. And so you can take any individual product or service and you can divide that up into all the steps necessary for production. And instead of a single individual doing all of those steps, you let multiple people do individual steps. And that's how that's sort of the specialization concept associated with the division of labor. And now let's sort of look into it a little bit deeper as to, well, how does that in fact increase wealth, and how does that, why is that relevant to me? And I want you to think of this in your business. You want to increase your wealth, you want to increase the wealth of your business, then if you believe in Adam Smith and his assertion, then you need to consider, how is it that I am going to increase the division of labor in my business? Okay, so we've agreed, in order for wealth to exist, production needs to occur. That is to say, we can't just sit around and wait for things to appear out of nowhere. And notwithstanding this bizarro world in which we exist these days, any appearance of the increase in wealth based on a central authority fiscal policy is both temporary and illusory. It doesn't exist. It's not real. We've already agreed that we need some production to occur in order for wealth to occur. So the production, the conjuring of digital currency out of thin air does not create wealth. There's no productivity there. There's this commensurate exchange of productivity that's necessary in any closed system. And we'll think of this world, the entire world, the global economy, as a closed system. It has to occur, productivity. So don't fall for this concept of, well, the governments can make it all right. Any central authority, fiscal policy combined with the monetary policies of central banking is by design confounding, and it's really meant to confuse you. And because at its core, there are some things that are pretty controversial, and some might even say, evil. At minimum, the illusions surrounding any central authority, freebie, or stimulus package is designed to detract from its insidious and deleterious nature. So think of this. Anytime that occurs, there's actually a redistribution of wealth. It's not the creation of wealth. It's robbing Peter to pay Paul. And within the context of your business, or even a smaller group like maybe your family or whatever, you can understand that if one central authority just took something from one person and gave it to another, nothing's been created. There's no additional wealth there. Within the system, the wealth remains the same, only you essentially stole from one person and gave to the other. Now, maybe you're a parent who's doing this and you think it's fair and right, and oftentimes central authorities are well-intentioned and they want good things to happen, and they're maybe in their mind thinking they're doing the right thing, but you and I have to agree that we're trying to create wealth here, and the redistribution of wealth is not the creation of wealth. And in fact, that's why I refer to it as deleterious, is because it detracts from motivation, it takes away from actual productivity occurring in society, and some people become very addicted to it and rely on these types of things. It's in essence, it's stealing. And here's why: because no central authority has its own self-created and sustaining treasury from which they can give. So I think, of course, charity and benevolence are really good things, and they're very different things. For an individual to have produced something and to have something that he owns and decide to give it to somebody who's less fortunate, that's a great thing. And it's a very probably necessary thing for the world to operate, and I would encourage it. But a central authority can't do that because it doesn't own anything. It can only take things from one person and then give to another. That's not benevolent, and that's not charitable. That's stealing. And we need to exercise our own free will in order to be charitable and to do something that is defined as good. So sorry, I kind of went on a rant there about central authorities, but these days this is something that's pretty topical, and the audience that I have, you entrepreneurs, you business owners and managers, don't get caught up in that. Most of you understand this fundamentally. I thought it was worth taking a little bit of a side-tracked discussion there to agree that we can't rely on those kinds of stimulus and those illusory freebies, those quote, and I put air quotes around freebies. Of course, we understand as entrepreneurs, nothing's free in this world and we have to produce it. So let's get back to division of labor and how does that create wealth? So we said that division of labor is specialization. It's taking the production, we're going to produce things, it's taking the entire process of production and dividing it up into specializations among many cooperating individuals. And you can think of this in terms of examples any way you want. You could think of this as a group of guys who went out to live in the woods, or people on a deserted island who were shipwrecked or whatever, and everybody could produce for himself. So whatever your needs and wants are, remember that's what we were talking about in terms of wealth, your standard of living, you could try to produce everything yourself, or you could cooperate with one another and divvy things up, divide things up, division of labor. You could divide things up based on your strengths and those things that most interested you and so on. And that's one of the reasons division of labor is useful, is that it will often result in people gravitating toward those things that are of greater interest to them and those things for which they have a greater propensity or skill level. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. So you think of this as dividing up the production of anything, whether it's making a home, whatever the product or the service is, a widget, some kind of service A, B, or C, divide up the production. Now, why does, we said that it increases productivity, and you could say, well, why? We could ask the 5 whys. Why does it increase productivity? The reason it increases productivity is the inherent nature of the division of labor to eliminate inefficiencies. It's more efficient. And let's explore why the division of labor is more efficient. So think about if you were doing something, we were creating whatever. If you had to do a process once per day, then you wouldn't become as skilled at it as if you had to do that same particular process 5 times per day or 10 times per day, 100 or 1,000. And the reason is experience. We talk about practice makes perfect. So if you were in the division of labor, you became more specialized in step number 1, you would get really good at that through the practice, through your experience of doing that, you would just become much more skilled. And you can think about another person who stepped in one day and you sort of oversaw them doing that. They wouldn't have your skill set just because they're newer, it's newer to them, or they're not doing it as frequently. So with the volume of production, comes the efficiency of specialization, or with the volume of production and specialization comes the efficiency of experience. Another way to look at it is somebody focused on a narrower part of the production process will become increasingly intolerant of inefficiencies. So you think of, they may introduce superior processes, techniques, tools, equipment into the process. Now think of it if you had to saw a particular board to a specification. Would you create a jig if you had to saw one board? Well, what if you had to saw 1,000 boards? Now you're thinking, I want to make sure I got the right tool. If you had to cut one board, you might get by with a hand saw. You might measure with a particular tape measure and your hands or whatever. But if you have to do this 1,000 times, you'd be like, okay, let's make sure we got the right tool in place. Let's make sure that we have some way that we're going to make sure it's the right length each and every time and be very efficient. You become intolerant. You'd be frustrated. In fact, it would get so mundane that you would force yourself to improve things. And you've done this, you've experienced this in your business and in everyday life. Something that you do, like it might be a particular recipe you're making in the kitchen. You make it once, it might have looked like a disaster zone by the time you were finished, and maybe it tasted great, or maybe it was a little bit subpar compared to what you expected or what you had tasted somebody else make it. But as you start to make that same dish over and over, you have more experience with that recipe, you start to change the tools you use. You set up differently, and the process that you follow has much more predictable results. You are intolerant of inefficiencies, and you get a better result. Not only a higher quality result, but you typically could do it in less time, it'd be cleaner and everything. And that leads me to the other thing, and that is inherent, again, to the degree to which the division of labor is well planned, it inherently eliminates waste. And we talk about MUDA, waste. So think about the 7 forms of waste. There's 7 main forms of waste and 1/8. So waiting. If you were, in my example of cutting the boards, and you've created this great process and you've got the best tools and you have the best setup in your facility, all this kind of stuff, the amount of time that people are waiting for the boards to come out would be greatly reduced. And because nobody's in your way and you're specialized in it, you're not waiting on other people, probably. And then conveyance, where you're having to bring materials from one area to another, well, you can do that much more efficiently in a division of labor. You've got all your raw materials right here, and you would set up a system in which, each time you cut the board, it goes into another stack and your finished materials. But you can imagine if you're doing this on a one-off basis, you might have to go all the way to the central storage of the raw materials. You'd have to grab it. You might have to process it in some way, and then you'd have to measure it and cut it, and you can understand. So conveyance would be cut down. Motion, you would set up your work area in such a way that you don't have as much motion necessary. Overproduction, so in my example of a recipe that you're cooking, if you cooked it once, maybe added a little, cayenne pepper, or if it was a dessert, maybe add a little vanilla extract. But you noticed later that it really didn't improve the quality that much. So you start to eliminate those things that don't add to the value proposition of the end product you're producing, and you don't over-process as much. And that again comes with experience. So you can start to eliminate over-processing, overproduction. And again, I said to the extent at which, to which your division of labor is well planned, you are thinking about this stuff in advance, and you wouldn't overproduce all those boards. You would think, well, how many boards do we need, and how many is the next step in the production likely to be able to receive at any given time? So you would have that planned out, and you wouldn't have the overproduction. You would have fewer defects because of the experience that the person has and the skill that they develop because of their specialization. So you can see that you're eliminating all the different kinds of waste. Now, I do acknowledge that on a micro level, you may actually increase certain kinds of waste, but I say there's a net reduction in waste. So maybe there is a little bit more conveyance because you, at the end of all this, you take your boards or whatever and you have to move them to a different part of the factory or a different part of the job site, and that's maybe a great increase in conveyance, but because you're doing it all at once, there's a net reduction in the conveyance. So I'm not going to get super into all the MUDA discussion and waste discussion today, but I want you to think of that. And then, of course, because there's collaboration and cooperation required in the division of labor and planning, you get the reduction in the wasting of ideas. People talk to one another and say, hey, how could we improve that? And there's just this inherent nature to reduce waste, and that increases efficiency, which increases production. And when we produce more things, we increase wealth. The real objective I had of my conversation today is to try to keep things simple again, is get you to break things down as simplified as possible in your mind and ask yourself questions. So are you taking advantage of the division of labor and specializations within your facility, within your business, within your production line, whatever it is? It doesn't matter what your business is. You have a logistical process that you have to engage in order to produce a product or service of value. And the degree to which you are able to introduce a division of labor, you will be able to increase wealth of your organization, and you'll be able to increase your personal wealth. And let's start by breaking it down to the simple, and that's why I went on that whole rant about government and everything, where people are actually believing that somehow there's a freebie, that there's the proverbial free lunch in the world, that a central authority, unless they're producing things, there's nothing, there's no wealth created. Redistribution of wealth is not the increasing of wealth. And so I want you to think of your business and how you can well plan a division of labor. Now, remember, it's not always meaning that you have to have more employees in your organization to have a division of labor. You could outsource things, you could source materials incoming. Perhaps you're producing some of your in-house, you're producing some of your you are converting raw materials into components within for the product or service that you produce. But then you think about it and you're like, well, in a division of labor, I might have this more specialized, somebody who specializes in creating the ideal, component A, B, or C for my widget. That I can go out and I can source that instead of creating that myself, and that should lead to wealth. These are really hard examples to give. If I discuss this with any individual, I challenge you, create an example of something where I can't explain to you how the division of labor, how some specialization will not result in greater productivity and greater efficiencies and greater wealth for you. I want you to think about this for your organization. That was my objective today. So that's where I think I want to leave it. I hope you got something out of this and it made sense to you. Give me some feedback, give me some pushback, give me an example of where, no, I think this would actually detract from my business. I have a unique business that this doesn't qualify for. Adam Smith was maybe a great philosopher and the world's greatest economist, but he didn't understand my business. Give me some pushback, leave a comment. It doesn't matter what you do in terms of your comments, if it's right or wrong, if I'm right or wrong. We all learn from one another when we do this and when we comment and we collaborate and communicate. And we need to learn from one another. Perpetual refinement.